No one expected the silence in room 408 to be so loud. It had been 3 weeks since Staff Sergeant Mason Everett was wheeled into Maple Creek Veterans Hospital in Alberta, Canada. 3 weeks since the accident. 3 weeks since his legs stopped working, and with them a part of his soul. Mason was a man built on motion. Raised in Oklahoma, he spent his childhood racing through cornfields, dodging dragonflies, and dreaming of flying jets. At 17, he enlisted in the Marines, chasing honor and purpose. But now, at 33, he lay motionless in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling that didn't answer back. The staff knew him as the quiet Marine. No complaints, no tears, just silence. He didn't want pity. He didn't want prayers. He wanted to forget. But someone else remembered. Down the hall, behind a steel door with a scratched-up nameplate, waited something. Someone that hadn't forgotten Mason Everett's voice. A German shepherd named Valor. 5 years earlier, they'd been inseparable. Partners, brothers. They served in Afghanistan together, sniffing out threats, saving lives. When Mason was injured in a roadside blast, Valor nearly died pulling him from the wreckage. But after the war, while Mason carried wounds no one could see, Valor was retired and placed in a different program. They hadn't seen each other since. Until now. The hospital had quietly arranged for Valor to visit. A surprise coordinated by Mason's former commanding officer and a nurse named Daniela Rivera, who'd seen enough shattered spirits to know when one was worth saving. But no one, not even Daniela, expected what would happen when they were reunited. That morning, as soft snow fell outside and the hospital hallways echoed with the beep of machines, Valor was led into Mason's room. Mason didn't look up. He thought it was just another therapy animal visit. Another stranger with fur and good intentions. Then came the bark. Short, sharp, familiar. Mason froze. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. His voice cracked for the first time in days. Valor! The dog stood alert, eyes locked, tail still. Mason's hand trembled. Then, in a voice he hadn't used since the war, he gave one simple command. Stand down. What Valor did next would leave everyone in the hospital frozen in place, and some in tears. Before we continue, tell us, what part of the world are you in right now? Drop your country in the comments. And if your heart paused for even a second, show your support with a like and a subscribe. Let's carry this feeling forward. Before he was Staff Sergeant Mason Everett, hero of the 89th Marine K-9 Division, he was just Mason from Muskogee. A quiet kid with big dreams and a stutter that made school feel like a battlefield. He was raised by his grandmother, Elsie, after his parents passed in a house fire when he was 7. Elsie used to say, "The world will try to break you, Mace, but you get to choose whether you bend or bloom." He remembered those words on cold nights overseas, buried in sand and silence. And yet, nothing prepared him for the day his legs stopped working. The explosion wasn't the worst part, it was waking up after. Realizing the strength he'd built, the pride he carried, was now trapped in a broken body. He didn't cry when they told him he might never walk again. Marines don't cry, but inside something shattered. After his honorable discharge, Mason withdrew from everyone. Even Valor, especially Valor. He couldn't bear to be around the dog who once followed his every step. Now that he had no steps left to give, he asked that Valor be placed in a service dog program for other veterans. He deserves more than a broken man, Mason had said. But Valor never forgot. And neither did Mason, not really. He'd replay their missions in his mind like old films. How Valor once detected a roadside bomb with just seconds to spare. How he curled up beside Mason during sandstorms, sharing warmth and safety. There was love between them, the kind forged under fire and silence. Mason had no family left. No visitors, no home to return to. Just memories. Until that snowy morning, when his past walked back in with 4 legs and eyes that hadn't aged a day. When Mason gave that quiet command, and Valor instantly dropped into a seated rest, the room didn't just freeze. It breathed. For the first time since he arrived, Mason felt something stir inside. Recognition. Belonging, hope, and outside the room, a few nurses wept. Not because of what Valor did, but because of what it meant. This was more than a reunion. It was a second chance. A moment of grace wrapped in fur and loyalty. Mason didn't cry. Not yet. But when Daniela walked in, holding his chart and wiping her eyes, she whispered, "He waited for you." Mason looked at Valor, now resting his head beside the wheelchair. "He always did." Dear viewer, have you ever seen something so pure it made you believe again? If this story has touched even a small part of your heart, would you let us know where you're watching from? Comment your country below. Let's see how far love and loyalty can travel. And if stories like these mean something to you, if they remind you of kindness or the power of second chances, consider following us. Not because we asked, but because maybe, just maybe, we all need more stories that heal. Mason's hand brushed Valor's ear. Felt the same. Warm. Real. Alive. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Not even close. And in just a few minutes, that would become heartbreakingly clear. Because what happened next, no one expected. And it would test not only their bond, but their ability to forgive and to fight for life again. The hospital hallway smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and something older. Grief, maybe. It was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock in Mason's room. Valor hadn't moved since obeying Mason's command. He sat still, focused only on him. A soldier waiting for orders. Mason couldn't stop staring. His hands trembled. It had been 4 years. 4 years since he last felt seen. "Is this real?" he whispered. Daniela stepped forward, kneeling beside the dog. "We weren't sure if he'd remember you," she said gently. "But the second he saw your photo, he barked. Once." "That bark," Mason breathed. "He used to do that before we entered a village. 1 bark, safe. 2, danger." Valor slowly lifted his paw and rested it on the footplate of Mason's wheelchair. Mason looked down, tears threatening. He remembers. But before he could say more, a sudden sharp bark broke the moment. The nurses jumped. Valor stood, eyes locked on the door. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked, voice suddenly steady, instinct kicking in. Then chaos. Down the hallway, an elderly patient had collapsed, triggering a code blue. A gurney rolled by, doctors yelling instructions. For everyone else, it was routine hospital emergency. But for Valor, it was war again. He bolted from the room, his body a blur of muscle and memory. "Valor!" Daniela shouted, chasing after him. Mason tried to roll forward instinctively, but the wheels caught the edge of the mat, jerking him backward. Frustration burned in his chest. He hated being helpless. When Daniela returned 10 minutes later, Valor was right behind her, calm as ever. "He didn't harm anyone," she said quickly. "He just stood over the patient until the paramedics came. Wouldn't move. That's what he does," Mason said quietly. "Protect." He turned to Valor, whose ears perked up at the sound of his voice. "Why'd you come back, huh? Thought you were done with me." Valor tilted his head and gave a soft whine. In that small sound, Mason heard it. Forgiveness. No blame. No questions. Just faith. "He didn't come back for what you were," Daniela said gently. "He came for who you are." Mason had no words, just memories of a time when he was more than the man in the chair, when he was needed, when his voice meant something, and now it did again. That night, Daniela brought a cot into Mason's room. "Only for a couple days," she warned, smiling. "Therapy protocol." But everyone knew what this was. Healing, disguised as company. In the quiet hours past midnight, as snow painted the world outside his window, Mason reached down and scratched behind Valor's ear. "You waited," he whispered. Valor shifted closer. And in that moment, no medals, no headlines, no audience. Mason Everett began to return to himself. But healing never comes without resistance. And tomorrow, someone from Mason's past would arrive. Someone he hadn't seen since the explosion. Someone who didn't believe Valor or Mason deserved a second chance. What she said would nearly break them both. The next morning was quiet, too quiet. Even Valor felt it. He paced the room, ears twitching with every sound in the hallway. Mason, half sitting in his wheelchair, rubbed the stiffness from his hands. "Easy, buddy. It's just another therapy day." But it wasn't. When the knock came, it was softer than usual. Hesitant. Daniela stepped in first, eyes uncertain. Behind her stood a woman Mason hadn't seen since the darkest moment of his life. Sergeant Lila Monroe. She wore civilian clothes now, but her posture was still sharp, her chin still held high. Her voice, however, trembled. "Hey, Mason." Mason's body stiffened. Valor stood immediately, placing himself between Mason and the door. "I'm not here to fight," she said gently, her eyes lowering to the dog. "Still guarding him, huh?" Valor didn't move. Mason nodded toward a chair. "If you came this far, might as well sit." Lila eased into the seat. For a long time, no one spoke. The clock ticked. Valor's breathing was the only sound in the room. "I read your file," Lila finally said. "Didn't even recognize you at first." "I read yours too," Mason said, voice cold. "Said you blamed the mission failure on me." She flinched, the pain showing in her eyes. "I did. I was angry. You were the team lead, and we lost 2 good men that day." Mason's jaw clenched. "And you lost a good dog. Except he survived." Valor shifted closer to Mason, sensing the weight in his tone. "I thought you abandoned him," Lila whispered. "I thought you didn't care anymore." "I cared too much," Mason said, the words catching in his throat. "I couldn't face him. I couldn't face myself." The room thickened with silence. Then Lila's eyes welled. "I was wrong, Mason. You didn't fail. You survived." Her voice cracked. "And I've been carrying this bitterness around like a badge. But seeing him come back to you, maybe I was blaming the wrong person." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A military tag, battered, scratched. It had belonged to one of the men they lost, Private Cole Ramsey. "I found this in your gear after the blast," Lila said. "Been holding onto it for years. I think it's time it came home." Mason took it, his hand shaking. "He was only 20, he whispered. "And you tried to save him," Lila replied. "You did what you could." Tears finally escaped Mason's eyes. "He called for his mom," Mason said. "And I couldn't even move." Valor let out a soft whimper and rested his head on Mason's lap. "You were paralyzed before the explosion, Mace," Lila said. "Just not in body. You've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you." She reached over, placing her hand on his. "You're allowed to heal." In that moment, Valor rose to his feet, walked around the bed, and placed his head gently in Lila's lap. She gasped. "He remembers you." "No," Mason said softly. "He forgives you." Later that night, Mason wheeled himself to the therapy room. It was the first time he asked to go voluntarily. Not because he believed he could walk, but because he believed in trying again. Valor walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, as equals. And when Mason stood up for a few seconds, holding the bars with trembling arms, the entire room broke into quiet applause. He looked at Valor. The dog gave one soft bark. One bark, safe. Sometimes the wounds we carry aren't the ones people see. Sometimes the hardest war is the one we fight in silence. But when forgiveness finds its way in, even through the door we locked shut, it brings something extraordinary with it. The chance to begin again. The road to healing wasn't smooth. The next morning, Mason tried to dress himself. His hands wouldn't cooperate. Buttons slipped through his fingers. Socks felt like mountains. He slammed his fist into the bed rail, frustration boiling over. Valor sat nearby, watching calmly. When Mason dropped the shirt onto the floor, the dog picked it up and placed it back on his lap. Again and again, without complaint. "That's not helping," Mason muttered. "I'm not who I used to be." But Valor stayed. Day after day, Mason showed up to therapy. Sometimes he made progress, a longer stand, a stronger grip. Sometimes he didn't. And when he didn't, the anger came. "I'm done," he said one Thursday. "This is pointless." Daniela crouched in front of him. "It's not about what you can do today," It's about what you're willing to try tomorrow. Mason stared at the floor. I'm tired of being broken. You're not broken, she said. You're rebuilding. He didn't answer, but Valor placed his head on Mason's knee. That small gesture spoke louder than any speech. Later that week, a group of young students visited the hospital as part of a kindness program. They asked to meet the Marine with the brave dog. Mason hesitated at first, but then he rolled into the common area, Valor trotting beside him. A little girl with braids approached. Did your dog save you? Mason looked down at Valor. More than once. Is he magic? Maybe, Mason said with a soft smile. Or maybe just loyal. She reached out and hugged the dog. Valor stayed still, soaking it in. As Mason watched, something shifted inside him. Maybe this was his new mission. Not walking again. Not fighting anymore. But showing up. Being seen. Being a reminder that healing doesn't always mean going back to who you were. Sometimes it means growing into someone new. Still, there were hard days. Mason struggled with nightmares. Flashes of the explosion, the screaming, the silence that followed. He'd wake in a cold sweat, shaking. Valor would always be there, lying across his legs, grounding him in the present. You're the only one who doesn't treat me like I'm broken, he whispered one night. But one day, even Valor struggled. A loud crash in the cafeteria, a dropped tray, sent him into alert mode. He barked, low and sharp, and positioned himself between Mason and the door. Mason gripped his wheels. It's okay, boy. It's just a tray. Valor didn't move. He was back there again, Afghanistan. Just like Mason had been too many times. And in that moment, Mason realized something deep. They were both healing. Together. Side by side. One step, one command, one breath at a time. Spring came quietly to Alberta, melting the snow off rooftops and waking up the trees. Mason sat by the hospital garden in the early morning light, watching a robin build a nest in the branches above. His wheelchair hummed softly beneath him. Valor sat at his side, alert but relaxed, his head resting gently against Mason's leg. You know, Mason said softly, I never thought I'd feel the sun like this again, not and actually notice it. A breeze carried the scent of pine and promise. Daniela joined him with 2 cups of coffee. You've come a long way. I didn't do it alone, he said, giving Valor a fond glance. No one ever does. The last few months had been hard, but they were filled with moments that stitched Mason back together. He learned to move differently, speak more openly, and even sleep through the night without waking in a sweat. His legs hadn't returned, but his spirit had. And more than that, so had his sense of purpose. One afternoon, Mason was invited to speak to a group of young veterans. Nervously, he wheeled onto the small stage. Valor padded beside him, wearing his original service vest, now patched with scars and memories. I used to think strength was about muscles, Mason began. About being the fastest, the toughest, the loudest in the room. He paused, eyes finding Daniela in the back row. But I was wrong. He looked down at Valor, who gazed back like he'd been waiting to hear it too. Strength is knowing when to ask for help. It's choosing to love again when you've lost everything. It's looking at yourself in the mirror, even when you don't recognize what you see, and saying, I'm still here. The room was silent, the air heavy with truth. I thought I lost my purpose when I lost my legs. But it turns out my purpose didn't leave, it just changed. The applause was quiet at first, then steady, then thunderous. Back at the hospital, Mason rolled through the halls with Valor beside him. Not as a patient anymore, but as a mentor. He helped new veterans find their footing, sometimes emotional, sometimes literal. And every time he wheeled past room 408, he smiled. That was where the story had broken and begun again. We all carry pieces of the past, some heavy, some quiet. But when someone, even just one soul, stands beside us and says, I still believe in you, everything can change. And for Mason Everett and a dog named Valor, it did. Not with medals, not with miracles, but with love, loyalty, and one final order that gave them both the strength to begin again. Some stories don't end. They echo. In the quiet steps of a service dog. In the steady hands of a nurse who refuses to give up. In the trembling voice of a Marine who finds the courage to speak again. Mason and Valor's story is more than a reunion. It's a reminder that healing doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes, it arrives broken, scarred, and silent, until someone or something helps you believe again. There are veterans like Mason in every corner of the world. Men and women who gave their all, and came home carrying invisible battles. There are animals like Valor, waiting for purpose, for connection, for someone to say, "You still matter." So if this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Take a moment, reflect on what you carry, then ask yourself, who needs a second chance in your world? Is it a person you've shut out? An apology you've left unsaid? An animal waiting for a home? Right now, someone is one act of kindness away from healing. One gentle word, one open door, one simple yes. And you might be the person who gives it. So tell us, where are you watching from? What part of the world is holding this moment with us? Drop your country in the comments below. Let's show how far love, loyalty, and second chances can travel. If the story brought you hope, if it reminded you of something beautiful inside yourself, then don't just scroll past. Let your heart be heard. Tap that like button, not for us but for Mason, for Valor, for every broken piece that's learning to become whole again. Subscribe to the channel, not because it's what everyone says, but because maybe, just maybe, you believe the world still needs stories like this. Comment your country below, and if this moment touched you, hit like and subscribe, because kindness deserves to be passed on. Stories that make us feel. Stories that make us better. Share this with someone who needs it, because healing doesn't happen alone, and neither does hope.